Hey everyone, and welcome back to Pro Life Without Borders with Sarah and Mikayla. So we are talking about today. We're going to talk about something that's been very timely.
Yeah, and it's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Like I feel like it's the only thing the news reports on these days.
Okay, that's not true because I saw a report that there has been a Highland cow loose in Connecticut for a month. And nobody has been able to recapture him. And there's just all these photos of him. And you know how they have those bushy, like they're very bushy.
like the
all you
bangs.
see is like his bangs and his horns. And he
doesn't care. Like he's living his best life.
He's loose in Connecticut.
I also saw about like it was in Pennsylvania, the egg heist. Like, did you see that?
No,
these people, like I think it was two guys stole like $100,000 worth of eggs.
Is that like 3 eggs?
Right? It was something like 40 dozen. I can't even remember.
Where?
I don't know, like a farm. Like I think they hijacked a truck or something like that. It was, I don't know, but all my friends were talking about it, and I was like, they're like, look, it's Pennsylvania, and I was like, well,
that's embarrassing.
Like we love being in the news.
Did they hand gather them? Like I have this vision of these men just like hand gathering
in black with like ski masks in the chicken coop.
Chickens are like.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how it went down. I just saw that it was like an insane amount of money, and quite frankly, not an insane amount of eggs.
Sad. I did not enjoy having chickens, but as the price of eggs continues to rise, I am reconsidering.
Yeah, I'm scared of birds, so like I'm not.
Chickens aren't like real birds.
I was like, chickens are probably, I could do chickens. We've had chickens growing up. Like I could. I don't have like this strong desire. You know, like some people are like, I just want to have a homestead. Not me.
No, I don't either.
Not me.
Anthony does. He can homestead and I'll go to work.
Yeah, I was like, I would, if that's just how it shook out, I could make do. But
did you even have chickens where you are?
I think so.
Where would you put them? On your like balcony? Like, do you have space?
Well, yeah, I was like, realistically, no, but like legally, yes, because I used to live somewhere where you could not have chickens legally, and they relocated. Charlene, sorry, they relocated the chickens from that city to a different town, and yeah, so I legally I could. So emotionally, I don't really want to, but I thought about it when I was trying to buy eggs at Aldi, and they were $6.
So the weird thing is that even though we're out in Amish country, we are technically not allowed to have chickens, which we didn't know, because like if you look online at zoning laws, it appears that you are. And so we got chickens, and then we found out that you're not allowed to have chickens, and we were like, that's the weirdest thing I've ever heard. But we were already planning on like giving them to my sister anyway.
Yeah, that makes no sense that you guys wouldn't be allowed. It made sense where I previously lived, why we weren't allowed to have chickens. People were like, it's government oversight. And I was like, sometimes you do enough stupid things, the government has to step in. And so there's no room for people to have chickens. But like where you live, you have tons of room for chickens.
And we're surrounded by farms.
Yeah,
so it is
like
very
your chickens could just roam around. They'd be fine.
According to the actual zoning laws, this is what the zoning person told us, because I was like, that's insane. You have to have 10 acres of ground to have chickens.
Whoa. That is a lot of land for a couple of chickens.
So I think probably what happened is somebody on the zoning board in time immemorial, I mean, who knows, it could have been like 30, 40 years ago, had a neighbor that had chickens and they did not appreciate it. And so they kind of fixed it so that only people with farms could have them.
Yeah.
But the reality, like nobody really cared, honestly. Like the zoning guy didn't even really care. He was just like obligated to be like, hey, you're not supposed to have chickens.
Well, and you always get like the one person who ruins it for everyone, right? Who has 3 square feet of land and they've put 400 chickens in it, and now we
have a law.
And now there's a law, and so it is what it is.
And our chickens, like, they were happy.
Yeah, I mean, I saw your chickens. Like, I benefited directly from your chickens, so I'm kind of sad you don't have them.
Well, and Anthony is fun too, because not that we could. And I think it was actually that he couldn't hunt them in our backyard, so it didn't matter. But our turkey would call a wild flock of turkeys every morning. Like they would just swing by and say hello, like every morning.
Okay.
And so but during turkey season, I think we're too close to other houses.
Yeah.
Because it would have been.
Is it like baiting the turkeys?
Really baiting.
Yeah, like it technically isn't.
Not
I mean, I guess like
our turkey out in the woods,
right?
Like he's living in his house.
He's just being a turkey and
gobbling his little heart out.
Whatever.
Anyway,
I hope everyone's like being able to afford eggs.
So here's the thing. You know, a couple decades ago, men were looking for women who looks good in a miniskirt, or were attractive, or were good at parties. And honestly, now they just want a woman who can catch a chicken.
Yeah, which is probably why I'm still single. Because I don't look good in mini skirts, and I don't want to catch a chicken. I could.
You need to pick one.
I could catch a chicken, but I simply do not want to.
That's what men are looking for.
I know, and I don't.
Put it on your Hinge profile.
No, I don't even have a Hinge profile. But if I did, I'm not I would put very specifically, I'm not really interested in having a homestead.
Okay,
but that might change depending on how many flocks die off from the bird flu or whatever.
Right. You're probably only a few dollars a dozen eggs away from wanting a homestead.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. So anyway, other than the bird flu and the price of eggs and this Highland cow loose in Connecticut, those are obviously the hard-hitting news stories.
Yeah.
Another one that we have been watching is the defunding of USAID.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people, so I have always called it USAID in my heart.
Yeah.
But everyone is calling it USAID.
Yeah. So I don't know why that, I don't know if that's intentional or if it's just people have it. I've always called it USAID. I have people who I know who are associated with USAID, and they refer to it as USAID.
But then everyone else is
USAID. So I don't know which one is correct.
There's no way they didn't call it that on purpose.
Right. And that's a whole other thing that we could get into, but we're not. So
it's called USAID.
Yeah, I just refer to it as USAID. We're talking about the United States Agency for International Development.
Yes.
USAID, whatever you want to call it. It's been defunded. Mostly. And that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah. And obviously, because of who we are and our specific interests in the pro-life issue, we are going to be talking about it in relationship to contraception and abortion.
Yeah.
There obviously are other facets to USAID.
Well, that's what as I was researching for this podcast episode, it is just an insanely large organization.
Yeah.
The budget was massive. And obviously, international development is a very vague term.
Mm-hmm.
So they had multiple toes and multiple ponds.
That is such a weird word picture. How many toes did they have?
I don't know, at least 10. And each one had its own pond.
There's so many toes.
So
many small ponds.
It was actually really hard to narrow it down to here's what we're talking about, just because it encompasses so much.
And I think there's a debate to be had that we are not going to have, because neither Mikayla nor I are foreign affairs specialists or experts or even very aware necessarily.
Yeah.
There is definitely an argument to be made for lots of aid overseas and for not having lots of aid overseas. And that is not an argument that we're going to have, because we frankly don't know. And it wouldn't be useful for us to sort of just wonder. But what we can talk about is whether our aid, if we choose to send it, should go to contraception and abortion. And what did that look like under USAID?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things, I was actually listening to another podcast. We're big fans of BBC Africa Eye. So if you're interested in African issues, I highly recommend BBC Africa Eye. They've got a YouTube channel. They have all sorts of documentaries about all sorts of things.
And I use it a lot for training our chat line staff.
They cover a lot of things on abortion and sex trafficking. And I'm not saying that I always agree with the views that BBC Africa Eye puts out, because sometimes it is very pro-choice, but it's just, if you're interested in learning more about Africa in general, highly recommend that channel. But they have a podcast that they put out every day. And they very recently did an episode on the defunding of USAID and how it was going to impact Africa. And so the biggest thing that Africa feels is going to change was the funding for the PEPFAR program. And I had
never heard of until Mikayla sent me some links.
So I had heard the term PEPFAR, but I actually didn't know what it meant. It was just out there in my brain.
I need whoever comes up with these acronyms to come name one of our because I feel we have such a hard time naming things, and someone out there was dang it, PEPFAR.
PEPFAR.
That's really catchy.
So PEPFAR is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And obviously HIV and AIDS is a very big deal in Africa. It's a very big problem. And so this program came about to help send funding to AIDS research and relief, and it was largely funneled through USAID. Now you might be thinking, what does What does HIV and AIDS have to do with pregnancy help?
What a great question. What a great question. And honestly, and we had talked about this a couple episodes ago about how a lot of funding for abortion coming from the United States was being hidden in other bills and other funding programs. So it's not like you can go on to whatismygovernmentpayingfor.com, which would actually be a great website. And like look up abortion, and all these bills labeled abortion funding are going to pop up because it's all tucked into these other initiatives. And one of those initiatives was PEPFAR, this emergency plan for AIDS relief.
Yeah. So one of the, obviously, HIV and AIDS, we're talking about sexually transmitted diseases.
Which, I mean, HIV and AIDS can be transmitted other ways, but primarily it's sexually.
Right. And so one of the things that this program initially had when it was started, and I think it was started under the Bush administration, was that 30% of the funding had to go towards abstinence education, which makes sense when you're talking about HIV and AIDS. Abstinence would be a very big part in prevention.
Right. Because the only way to ensure that you do not get an STD is to not have sex.
Right. And again, we understand that HIV can also be transmitted through needles and whatnot, but it's
blood,
largely,
mother to child.
Right.
Yeah.
It's largely considered an STD.
Right.
So that sounds like a great thing, right? 30% of funding needs to go towards abstinence education. USAID had a problem with that.
Not a big fan of abstinence education.
They were not a big fan of abstinence education at all. They felt that it was infringing on people's rights. There was just a lot of weird pushback against that. And so, long story short, since 2008, that's no longer been a requirement. So we're sending out quite a lot of funding for HIV and AIDS, and abstinence is no longer something that we're pushing. Also involved with this PEPFAR program is this clause that if you were going to receive PEPFAR funding, you needed to sign a clause that was basically a no prostitution clause. Like, we don't support prostitution. I did not think that this was a controversial thing, but it turns out that it was very controversial. So controversial that there were 2 Supreme Court cases about USAID and their no prostitution clause.
Which is crazy to me because you cannot support prostitution and still help women who are selling themselves for sex.
Right.
Like, those two things are not mutually exclusive. Like, it's not like you're saying, oh, we either have to 100% support prostitution or we can't help anyone who has potentially contracted AIDS or may contract AIDS because they're engaging in sex work.
Right. But the argument that USAID made was, well, by forcing organizations to sign this clause, it's considered coerced speech or compelled speech, and it's isolating people who would benefit from this program. So their fear was, if an organization signs the no prostitution clause, sex workers were not going to want to use their services. And obviously sex workers are at risk for HIV and AIDS because it's an STD.
That's such a hot take.
Right. So so it ends up being this whole thing. There's a lawsuit that happens about, because USAID claims that it's compelled speech to force organizations to sign this agreement and that it's a First Amendment violation. Right.
Okay.
So it goes to the Supreme Court in 2013. The Supreme Court rules that it's compelled speech and that organizations don't need to sign it.
But what is that? And maybe we don't know, but what does that mean? I mean, does that mean that, brothels, for lack of a better word, can benefit from PEPFAR?
Basically.
Which is kind of crazy to me. So, like, could you be actively engaging in selling sex or coercing others into selling sex? And could you, and this is a question, I don't know, could you be getting money from USAID for some kind of HIV help?
Right.
Potentially, I guess.
Essentially, what that lawsuit ended up, like, the ramifications were that foreign nonprofits have to sign the agreement. US-based nonprofits do not.
Oh, that's interesting. I guess because they would say that if it's compelled speech, that other countries don't have the right to free speech like we do.
Right. So then there was another lawsuit, another court case rather, came out of it because the 2013 Supreme Court ruling was essentially saying it's compelled speech, and compelled speech violates the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. Well, then came the question of, what about countries that don't have the First Amendment? Like, do other countries have rights that American citizens have? So, like, can it be a First Amendment violation if you don't have the First Amendment?
Or any amendments.
Or the and so they assumed no. So they ruled in, I think, 2020. It was actually the first court case that happened virtually.
Huh.
Like, random fact that no one cares about. But yeah. So obviously USAID is, I don't want to go as far as to say pro-prostitution, but they were against a non-prostitution clause,
which is
in abstinence. And obviously we know that human trafficking is this pregnancy help and abstinence, pregnancy help, are all tied together. And so that's an issue.
Well, and really, I mean, the spread of HIV and AIDS is as well. We are just now launching, and we will have launched by the time this airs, testing for HIV and AIDS here at the center.
Yeah.
Because it is such a big deal, because it is fatal, right? Mm-hmm. If not treated. And here it's reasonably rare, mm-hmm. but it's not in Africa. And a lot of women are dealing with AIDS through, I'm going to say, no fault of their own.
Right.
So, and I understand we're saying like, oh, abstinence prevents STDs. It does, but you're obviously not going to engage in abstinence with your husband.
Yeah.
Who may also be getting sex from somewhere else where he's contracted AIDS. Mm-hmm. Also, a lot of it, not a lot of it, but some of it's transmitted like mother to child.
Right.
And so obviously you can't prevent that. And then, or you can't, I shouldn't say that, you can prevent it, but like if you're the victim, like you're the child, you know, it's
yeah, like if your mom had HIV and you were born and those precautions or protections were implemented, now you have HIV to no fault of your own.
Right. And then of course, rape.
Yeah.
And I remember as a child, probably way too young, sorry, Mom, watching like a 2020 thing, and it was about like men in Africa believing that sex with a virgin mm-hmm. would cure you of AIDS. And mm-hmm. so girls as young as like 8, 9, 10 were being like jumped on their way home from school and raped by gangs of men who had HIV. And so there are a lot of ways that women can contract it, men can contract it, that's not really, you know, their fault. Mm-hmm. Because they're sort of the victim of a crime, or they're just a victim of it being transmitted to them. But that being said, like abstinence is still, you know, the best way to prevent it.
Right. So when we're talking about the defunding of USAID, recognize that it was an organization that inherently opposed abstinence education and had some very sketchy opinions about non-prostitution clauses.
Right. But wait,
there's more because, and I would say this is probably the big thing that you and I are concerned about just because we work with it on a daily basis, is the funding that was going towards family planning, contraception, abortion. Those three terms in a lot of countries are just rather synonymous.
Right.
And so when you see family planning, especially internationally, especially when it comes to organizations that receive aid from the United States, you can almost guarantee that it includes abortion.
Yes.
They just sneak it in there.
We would say birth control and use it as a term for contraception. Mm-hmm. In Africa, they use family planning.
Yeah.
So, and it could mean anything. It could be pills, it could be implants, it could be the IUD, it could be Essure, which is no longer here in the United States, but is still being given to women overseas.
Could also be sterilization, mm-hmm. which we'll get into with USAID.
Yeah. So yes. So whenever you see that U.S. funding is going towards family planning, it does mean contraception. Mm-hmm. It does mean abortifacients, mm-hmm. and it often means abortion.
Right.
And women in the United States, when we say, "Oh, I'm not using that, it's dangerous," Essure is a great example. Mm-hmm. You know, Essure had migrates out of where it's supposed to be in your fallopian tube and just wanders around your body, which is really bad because mm-hmm. you shouldn't have metal coils just wandering around.
Yeah. Maybe explain to people Essure, okay. Like for people who don't.
So Essure was supposed to be like the birth control for a little bit. You had it inserted into like your fallopian tube, and it would basically block it and eventually kind of cause like a tubal ligation.
Yeah, it was like, I don't want to say the predecessor to the IUD, but
no, like IUD existed before Essure.
Right, but like it similar concepts, right? Like your this implant long term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. and found out lots of side effects.
Inserting stuff in your fallopian tube really doesn't sound like a great idea.
So a lot of women had a lot of problems with it. And so what did we do with it? We shipped it to Africa.
Yep.
And so now it's being put in women.
It's not good enough for the U.S., so we'll just send it to Africa.
Yeah. And they're like coming to their local town or city or whatever, and they're getting this contraception, family planning. They don't even necessarily know what they're getting because no one's really telling them. And then they go back to their home in their village, and there's no follow-up, there's no care. And if they have issues, well, that's just too bad.
Right. So all of this to say, USAID was considered to be one of the world's largest providers of contraception overseas. I mean, just an insane, and I have like all sorts of news articles about just how much funding was going to contraceptive and family planning. And I'm looking for it. There it is. Roughly $600 million annually was the family planning budget for USAID. And half of that, so roughly $300 million every year, was going to Africa.
And if I read correctly, it was specific countries in Africa too.
Yes, it was. I think they listed 15 that were kind of like, and I think we as in Promise of Life Network have talked with clients in all 15 of those countries.
The ones that I read, absolutely.
And a lot of them were Kenya, Uganda,
Nigeria,
Namibia, Mozambique,
Sierra Leone,
all of which we have clients from, quite frankly, on a weekly basis for those.
Most of them. Botswana, I think, was one of them.
Yes. Yeah. So a lot of funding. $600 million is a lot every year, and to know that half of that was going specifically to Africa.
So just a side note, when I was looking up PEPFAR stuff, I had to Google how to type in a billion.
Because you didn't know.
I've never typed it into a calculator.
Yeah.
And I was trying to do math to determine like how much certain things cost per life saved or per person helped or whatever. And I had to Google like how many zeros is in a billion.
Yeah, no, I get that. Like you at some point after like 3 zeros for me, I'm like, I don't know what this means.
Exactly. Yeah. At that point, it's just pretend.
Yeah, you're like, this is made
and a billion of anything.
This is a made up number,
right? Like, can you imagine a billion M&Ms? It'd probably fill this whole room.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Anyway. I don't know. So anyway, they had a very large family planning budget, and again, multiple sources refer to them as the largest provider of contraceptives internationally.
Which I think we have to ask ourselves, why are we so interested in reducing the birth rate in Africa?
Yeah. So interestingly, as I was looking up, again, I had to do a lot of reading about USAID just because it's so massive and the term gets thrown around all the time now that I'm like, what are we even talking about anymore? And so I found the origins of USAID, it turns out, are not super great. Or at least the family planning program.
Yeah.
Not super great. So USAID started in 1961 or something like that. But USAID's family planning program started in 1965. So just think about the cultural context of 1965.
We're talking about free love. We're talking about not the roaring 60s, the roaring 20s. The roaring 60s. I'm going to make the roaring 20s. But no, then the free love movement was big in the 60s.
Yes.
Abortion obviously is about to become legal in the entire country in 1973.
Yeah.
There's lots of drugs, lots of breaking from traditional morals.
Right. There's also a really big civil rights movement going on in the 60s.
Yep.
And so USAID starts their family planning program in 1965. And this is coming from a pro-choice source, by the way, like what I'm reading here, as an anti-population growth initiative. And to quote someone who actually received, I guess, funding from USAID, it was really a racist program to ensure that Black and brown people had less babies, but it morphed over time into being the backbone of the reproductive health sector within global health. So, surprise, USAID's family planning program had racist origins.
Shocking. Almost like another organization.
I was going to say, like, this is how you know a millennial, a young millennial is writing the podcast notes. I wrote down, it's giving Margaret Sanger.
Yes.
And Planned Parenthood.
And we have to realize that just like our time today, thought leaders are often crossing over and having influence on areas that maybe, it's not like Margaret Sanger was in a bubble.
No.
And she never talked to anyone else, and she never engaged with anyone else. One of the most famous people she ever talked to or engaged with was Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
And as you may be aware, Adolf Hitler took her ideas to the extreme in the form of racial cleansing with the Jews, the gypsies, homosexuals, all of that kind of stuff. Her thoughts, other thoughts in the same time frame, also influenced what eventually became the founding of the family planning arm of USAID.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the same time. Obviously, we're talking a few decades later. But those eugenicist ideals are still alive and well in organizations like Planned Parenthood and others. And if you'll notice, Planned Parenthood and USAID are focusing their contraception and abortion efforts on low-income Black and brown populations.
Right. And so USAID just had the ability to go to the source. We'll just funnel hundreds of millions of dollars to Africa
and try to get them to have fewer babies.
So the origins are not super great when it comes to the family planning arm. And as a result, there's a lot of just iffy things that were going on. So obviously we've talked about the Mexico City policy before. And so depending on who was in office, and that thing flip-flops every 4 years, the United States goes back and forth about whether or not taxpayer dollars can be used to fund organizations that support abortion. And so USAID's involvement in that has gone back and forth over the time that they've existed. So over the decades. So in that respect, it's very iffy to track because sometimes they were involved, sometimes they claimed they weren't involved.
Right.
Yeah. So there's just someone used the term dabbled, that they dabbled in abortion services. And I was like, okay,
well, like having toes in ponds.
It's like having their toes in all the ponds. They were dabbling, so to speak.
And I think something that the last month and a half has shown me is how hard it is to track where money goes and how it's used.
Yes.
And not that I was necessarily living in a bubble before and thought, oh, surely if it's against the law, it would never happen. Like, I'm not an idiot. I understand that. But you kind of think like, oh, if the president or Congress is saying you can't fund this, you have this crazy belief that you can't fund it. And the last 6 weeks have shown us, I think, that funding can really get very creative. And so I would question how often some of that funding was used for abortions, and people just aren't aware.
Right. So one of the things, again, while I was preparing to talk about this, was I tried to go directly to the source, which you can't do because the USAID website is down. Like they took it offline. And there's this kind of passive aggressive like 404 error on it that's just like in accordance with the president's executive blah blah. Like you could tell that whoever had to take the website down was a little bit ticked off about it. Yeah. So there's like this passive aggressive comment about how they're like reviewing all of their materials and reevaluating blah blah blah. Okay. So you can't go to USAID's website directly for stuff. I didn't think to use the Wayback Machine. That would have been the smart thing to do.
I never think about the Wayback Machine.
No, but like, does it work on government websites? Would be my question.
Like, I've actually never tried it.
Well, I love the Wayback Machine. So that gives me something to do later. But
because you needed something else to do.
Because I'm running out of things to do, so why not mess around? But so I couldn't find information directly from USAID. So I did the next best thing, which was started looking at organizations that up until USAID was defunded, received funding through them.
Right.
And I'll tell you what, there was some really sketchy stuff going on. One, if looking at it from a very broad perspective, USAID was funding some really weird stuff. Like, so turns out we were funding like some sort of gay musical in Ireland through USAID.
That is so not food for children, which is immediately, as soon as I think of USAID, all I think about is like little children and bags of rice. It's probably not, I mean, it's definitely not accurate, but like, that's what I'm thinking, like, because we're feeding people.
People assume that USAID was like our humanitarian aid arm, not realizing, again, I think that might be one of the, I'm just spitballing here, like, is that why people referred to it as USAID? Was that like a rather intentional,
I don't know,
thing? Because it's actually just international development, and that can include a whole bunch of stuff. There was a lot of like business investments and whatnot that USAID was also funding. But yeah, like there was the gay musical in Ireland. There was some sort of like transgender stuff in some other country. like just really bizarre things.
Well, I know that the lady that wrote Target Africa complained about U.S. and Western funding for trans and gay and all these different groups. And it was all like all these supposedly different groups were all funded by the same.
Yeah.
I wonder how much of that was USAID.
Yeah, I would guess probably quite a bit of it.
Okay.
So yes, USAID was funding things like PEPFAR, which inherently isn't wrong, right? Like wanting to treat HIV and AIDS is not wrong. We would support that, but the way they were going about it was wacky. But they were funding like a lot of really bizarre things.
Yeah.
So it's hard to keep track of. But I was looking at some of these organizations, and quite a lot of them use the term family planning. Some of them actually outright talked about abortion access. So,
and I think that's the other thing too. We often think about abortion funding as going directly to an abortion. Like we're donating $5 that's going to go to Uganda and pay for someone's abortion or whatever. Right. But what we don't realize, and what I realized when I was reading some of the things that you sent me about USAID, is how often it goes to lobbying. Yes. And just general abortion promotion.
Yes. So I think that was one way that they were really getting around that, was a lot of these organizations or advocacy groups and whatnot. And one of the big complaints against USAID outside of just their contraceptive and family planning was the political engagement, the political influence that they had. But I could definitely see that just within, our little contraceptive abortion bubble, that they definitely had a lot of influence. And there was a lot of questioning about whether or not morally that was something that the US should be doing. So that was weird. But yeah, so I looked directly at these organizations that were accepting USAID money, and it was not great. And then there was Mozambique.
We've worked with women in Mozambique.
So yes, we work with women in Mozambique. I wouldn't say that they're very common on our chat line, but we do get them from time to time. Quite frankly, we just don't advertise to people in Mozambique, and I think that's like literally the only reason we don't get a ton.
Probably not. Yeah.
But so all of this has been kind of USAID's not directly paying for abortions, but like they're being very iffy about this, that, or the other. Well, there was a situation in Mozambique where, and we have the news article somewhere in the stack of papers that I have about, essentially there were nurses that USAID failed to train properly. And so it was a situation where nurses, here we go. Yeah. Anti-AIDS program in peril after U.S. finds nurses in Mozambique provided abortions. So, 4 nurses in Mozambique performed abortions that are banned under the multi-billion-dollar program that has saved millions of lives globally, blah, blah, blah. Let's see. Service providers that get funding through the PEPFAR program are barred from providing abortion services under rules against U.S. foreign assistance being used for abortion-related activities. So going back to the Mexico City policy.
Yeah.
But the program has still faced criticisms from anti-abortion Republicans. What a term.
What a great t-shirt.
Yeah, I was about to say, like,
stay tuned.
Stay tuned. So it turns out that these 4 nurses in Mozambique performed a total of 21 abortions since January of 2021. I looked up the abortion laws in Mozambique. It's legal on demand up until 12 weeks.
Yeah, they're one of the more liberal nations. Mozambique, South Africa, and Botswana are kind of the 3 that I'm aware of that have more liberal abortion laws. And South Africa, I would say, is the most liberal.
Right. And this, everything that I was reading was like Mozambique's the most liberal, and I don't think so. I think South Africa would be in Africa. But Mozambique, it's on demand up until 12 weeks. And then they have like, if it's a case of proven rape, it's 16 weeks. And then it's up to 24 weeks in extreme cases, which you and I both know, like an extreme case could be anything.
Right.
Anyway, so these nurses were receiving PEPFAR funding and were performing abortions.
21 of them.
21 of them. So this was not one abortion. This was not one nurse. This was 4 nurses who, over the course of just a couple of years, did 21 abortions with U.S. funding.
Over years? I thought it was over like a month.
Well, it's since January of 2021.
Okay.
So
So 3 years, that seems like a very low number. I'll be honest with you.
Yeah, I'm not
If they're
entirely
willing
sure
to
on
provide
like
abortions, it's weird to me that only 21 of them were provided since 21.
right.
I love how you marked something sus.
Oh yeah, it said the officials said it was the first time a PEPFAR funded provider had been found to have provided an abortion in the program's 20-year history, and I just find that very suspicious.
It is very sus.
I understand that they included had been found to. So they're not saying that it hasn't happened. They just don't know about it.
Yeah. I mean, and maybe they're right. Maybe this has never happened before. This is an aberration. It's
maybe.
still 21 lives that were killed with American funds.
Yeah.
Which I find to be very problematic. And I think one of the challenges of the abortion conversation is we're so used to big numbers that they stop seeming like people.
Right.
But like, how would we react if we found out that U.S. funding helped slaughter 21 Mozambique children? Just children.
Right. So this all came about because, and I'm just reading directly off of the news article, the investigation in Mozambique was launched in late October of, I think this would have been 2024, when routine compliance measures found that some of the 2,751 nurses that received PEPFAR funding in the country of Mozambique did not receive required training on the prohibition of abortion in U.S.-funded services.
Interesting.
Now, I recognize that October of 2024 to mid-January of 2025, when this news article released, was a very iffy. There's a lot going.
There's a lot happening.
There's a lot happening. But to just be like, whoops, we forgot, is really something. So if anyone tries to tell you that PEPFAR has never funded abortions, you can just tell them that that's not correct. Even though they're like, well, it was an accident and it was training oversight on our part. 21 lives are 21 lives, and that's just the lives that we know of in Mozambique.
Right. So USAID is a big hamburger with lots of layers.
And lots of toes and multiple ponds.
So many toes and so many ponds. So much dabbling.
Yeah.
But we do know, we can say specifically that PEPFAR through USAID has funded abortion.
Mm-hmm.
USAID has funded abortion depending on the status of the Mexico City policy, and has funded family planning, abortion promotion, contraception, all of those sorts of things. And so it really comes down to the question of, and we're going to leave it as a question because we don't have the answer.
Right.
How much aid should America be sending overseas, and for what purposes?
Yeah. Because again, this goes back to, and we've talked about it before, and I'll talk about it until I die, the United States tying abortion-related services to other types of funding.
Right.
Specifically within Africa. Ticks me off. Like every time. It just makes me mad. Because Africa, and Africans will tell you that they don't want this.
Right.
And again, I think that was very telling, going back to that BBC Africa podcast I listened to. They said, like, the biggest thing that they think, is going to be impacted is PEPFAR. And that would make a lot of sense just because of the HIV and AIDS crisis. They're not crying about their loss to abortion services.
Right.
They're not crying about their lack of food. They're crying about the HIV and AIDS funding, which again, totally understand. Right. I'm not saying that everything USAID did was bad.
Oh, no, not at all.
And I don't think anyone, including the president that defunded it, is making that claim.
No, I mean, regardless of how you feel about money going overseas to other countries, good work was done. I mean, people's lives were saved. People's lives were improved through this funding. Even if maybe you personally don't agree with it or someone personally doesn't agree with it.
Right.
But there are also a lot of problems. So something else that you have in your notes, which I just find crazy, is that one of the controversies associated with USAID was paying over 100,000.
Nope, 100 times the local salary.
100 times a local salary.
So yes, so I came across that because it was interesting to me, because I'm fresh off of talking with an ex-abortion provider in Africa, who was employed by IPPF, the International Planned Parenthood Foundation. And one of the things that this provider talked about, he did not approve of abortion,
right,
but he was performing them. He was employed by IPPF because IPPF pays an insane amount of money more than other local healthcare opportunities. So in this case, this was a physician's assistant could make more money at Planned Parenthood than anywhere else. By a lot. Not just like 50 cents on the dollar, a lot. And so one of the other controversies of USAID is that they're ruining local economies essentially, because they're coming in and they're offering literally up to 100. Again, about those zeros. We're like, we're
Do you want me to Google how many zeros is 100?
The problem is I put an X there, and I just
was like,
it's throwing me off.
100.
I don't know.
No, okay.
No, so they're paying over 100 times local salaries,
whatever that may be.
Whatever that might be. USAID was paying up to 100 times that,
and that's problematic for a lot of reasons. First of all, you can end up coercing people into working for you.
Yeah, it's like if we're going to talk about compelled speech,
when it's contrary to their values because they want or need the money.
Right.
And their family needs them to make money, because in Africa, so here, people are very individualistic. And so my husband and I live alone in our home with our children, and we support our home. And my mom supports her home, and my sister supports her home with her husband. And if my mom needed help, obviously we would help her. But also in our country, if a family member needs help, it's not seen as bad for that family member to access government services. In Africa, people who have jobs are often supporting, actually Kechi was explaining this to me, are supporting lots of family members.
Yeah, like extended. I mean, you're talking like my second cousin's aunt, like.
Right. Siblings, cousins, parents, aunts, uncles.
Even like to some extent almost adopted family members, like close friends that are like family. They really build community.
And they're all, so if you have a job, you're supporting not just your husband or your wife and your children, you also might be supporting your parents, his parents, siblings, their children, cousins, their children. And then adding in the AIDS orphan issue, you could have a lot of people in your family and your extended family who don't have parents. And so you're trying to support them as well. And so getting a very high salary is a big deal.
Yeah.
It's not just more luxuries. It's often like saving the life of your relatives.
Yeah. And so they're coming in, they're offering all of this money. And quite frankly, it creates a dependency because what happens if the problem is solved and we don't need an office there anymore?
Right.
We've created like an entire, a village or a town's dependency on these kind of crazy salaries.
Well, in one of the podcasts I listened to, I don't know if it was Africa Eye or a different one, but they were talking about how like the biggest impact is going to be lost jobs. Because there's already unemployment issues in most of the countries in Africa. The most common thing we hear from our clients is that they can't find work, and there aren't protections for employment with like pregnant women or other things like that. And so they said that the first thing that's going to hit are people that are just in the job market now.
Right. And I think that's really important to bring up, just because I know from personal experience, I guess, like the people that are in my life, that's the big thing when we talk about like the defunding of USAID. It's people lost their jobs. And I know people personally who've lost their job.
Right, in the United States.
In the United States, because they were either federal employees or they were contracted out, and that contract ended when the organization stopped existing. And that's a very sad thing. Obviously, lost job, big deal, especially in this economy. It's tough.
Right.
I guess and so it's okay to feel sympathetic towards, especially when you hear of Africans losing their jobs. It's okay to feel sympathetic about that, but also we need to realize that, or I guess ask the question, were those people that we should have been employing in the first place?
Right. Did we cause this?
And I think, at least in the family planning arm of USAID within Africa, the answer is yes. And Africans would tell you that as well. Yeah. So it's not just, us uninformed people talking about this. Like, we have friends in Africa. I've been to Africa. They would tell you the exact same thing.
Right.
And they have. People just don't listen to them.
Yes. And that's what we need to be doing. We need to be listening to African voices, talking about their country, their needs, and what they want for their nation, and not just coming in. And I know that this is kind of an overused term, but not coming in as white saviors.
Yeah.
And saying, hey, we know how to fix this. We know how to make this better, and just forcing them to take our solution, because it's not right.
No, it's not right. And Again, we've talked about, if you're interested in this, Target Africa is a really great book. If you want to read about U.S. funding and how it impacts these African cultures, we are essentially pushing Western ideals onto African countries.
Right.
And for whatever reason, and I know that like that's a really touchy issue with some people, you know, talking about colonization, for lack of a better term. And we've colonized this and we've colonized that.
She calls it ideological colonization.
Yes, ideological colonization. So I think it's in my office. But that's essentially what we've done.
Yeah.
Continue to do is ideological colonization of Africa.
Right. We're no longer necessarily taking our ships over to Africa and exporting people and importing whatever and influencing tribal wars in the same way that we used to hundreds of years ago. But now we're doing it through aid packages and contraception and abortion and family planning. And we're pushing Western ideals that they find that the average African would find very offensive onto their children, onto their schools. And it's not appropriate.
No. And we've created a dependency. We've created an unstable economy in some of these villages and towns in Africa, especially rural Africa. And yeah, it's our fault. It's 100% on the US for creating this. And so whether or not funding needs to go overseas for aid programs is not our place to say. Whether or not USAID,
I'm qualified to even say.
Right. And I was like,
help everyone.
Whether or not USAID as an organization should be defunded entirely, not up. One, it's not up to us.
Yeah, no one's calling us.
No one's calling us for our opinion. And also, like, we can't really speak into that. What we can speak into is our personal experience with people who are directly impacted by this, who have been directly impacted for decades by abortion funding from the United States.
And I think if you are someone who's struggling with the pullback of U.S. funding, this is the time to give of yourself to organizations that you trust who are doing good work overseas.
Yeah.
And that could be like Promise of Life Network with our pro-life ministry. It could be other missions, nonprofits. There's a lot of them who are doing really amazing work in the hunger space with orphans, with families. And those are places that need your support. And so if you're bothered by USAID funding being stopped, by the taxpayer not sending all this money overseas, that is something that we can address as individuals.
Yeah. And we're happy to be transparent with you. I think that's a really big thing coming out of this, is that there was no transparency. Up until a couple of months ago, I had no idea what USAID was spending money on. You just hear like, oh, it's humanitarian work. And we assume that must be a good thing. I'm still trying to figure out how the gay musical in Ireland is humanitarian aid, but whatever. There was no transparency at all. And if you call Sarah or myself, I mean, you could call me. I just recommend calling Sarah.
I get really excited. She knows that if someone wants to talk about our budget, I'm going to be so thrilled.
We'll be we would be excited.
She means me.
Sarah would be excited, and I would willingly do so for a cup of coffee.
I'll do it.
Sarah will do it for free. I'll charge you a cup of coffee.
I'm going to get out the big screens.
The double monitor.
Double monitors.
No, we'd be happy to go over that with you. And a lot of it is public information anyway. As I was reminded last night when someone sent me our 990 form.
Which has my salary on it.
Which has your salary on it and our operating budget and expenses and whatnot. And I was like, well, like, thanks for sending this to me. I mean, I work here, so I understand. But, like, it was very awkward.
It's very awkward. Sometimes I have to really like reckon with the fact that my salary is public knowledge. Nobody else. So my salary is public knowledge because I'm the executive director.
Right. You're considered an officer.
Yes. Nobody else here hits the threshold. I technically don't even hit the threshold. It's just somebody has to.
We got to report someone's salary, so it might as well be Sarah's.
But one of my friends, I won't mention her name because she might be embarrassed, but she's another executive director, and she looked up my salary and she called me on the phone and was like, how are you living?
Well, that's essentially what happened when this person was sending me our 990. It was all in the context of average salaries. And my friends are very smart and I love them. And the Lord has called them to professions that pay very well. So engineers, we were talking actually about lawyers.
Did you put the donate link?
I need to, actually. So we were talking, because I was surprised lawyers I started it. I learned what lawyers make. I didn't realize that lawyers charge per 6 minutes. And so I was expressing to the friend group, and so anyway, that's how it started. And someone pulled up our 990 of where I work and sent it, and all they said was, oof.
Yeah.
And I was like,
Did you tell them I have 6 children?
I was just like, listen, we get a lot of work done for very little.
Yep.
And so when you're thinking about USAID and their $600 million of family planning budget,
we make significantly less than that.
We have a significantly smaller budget, and we have impacted, at this point, I can honestly say tens of thousands of lives.
Absolutely.
And we're very happy to be transparent about my international department budget. Whatever you need to know to donate, we're transparent about it.
We are. So this brings us to our Jesus moment. I didn't even tell you this because I didn't even tell Tom this.
Oh, that's scary, but okay.
I'm about to make a confession.
I was about to say, like, did you spend $4 on French fries again?
That was one time. I apologize on air.
Okay.
No, so I actually signed up to take a 6-week fundraising course.
Yeah, the board is going to love that.
Yeah, they're going to hate it because they're like, you don't have time.
Yeah.
And Tom will be like...
notes. I almost signed... Well, I was interested in something, and then I realized that it was like $400, and I was like, never mind.
No, this one wasn't $400.
It was like
not... It was not very much money at all.
Take notes.
Yeah.
It's probably like have a nice personality, in which case it's like, bummer.
No, it's through Heartbeat International.
Okay.
And I love I've heard really good things about the presenter, and I'm really excited about it. 6 weeks. It's very cheap. But they have a ton of scripture in it because, of course, Heartbeat is a Christian organization,
right,
and all of the pregnancy centers are Christian as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things we had to read about was the feeding of the 5,000, which I've obviously read a ton of times, but I've never thought about it from the perspective of the boy being a donor.
Oh.
Yeah.
Huh.
So this little boy gives all he has. In the world, probably,
which is just,
he's a little boy, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if they had piggy banks back then, but like his mom packs him a lunch.
Yeah.
He goes to hear the prophet, and they ask him for all he has.
Which is, 3
is a lot.
Fish and 2 loaves of bread, or
2 fish and 5 loaves of bread.
Yeah.
Which is a lot for a little boy. That's his lunch, and boys love lunch. I have 6 of them.
Yeah, I was about to say that's actually a pretty substantial lunch, but I guess he's a boy.
He's a boy, yeah. Honestly, that probably wouldn't even get him until like dinner.
Right.
And so they ask him for all he has, and he says yes. And I believe that if you look at the scriptures through the eyes of consent, that God really, he always waits for that yes.
Mm-hmm.
So he says yes, and Jesus takes his offering, which is small, even though it's significant to him, and just multiplies it thousands and thousands and thousands times.
Yeah.
And feeds these 5,000 men and their families. And I looked at that and I thought, this just hit me like a ton of bricks. God is taking the very generous contributions of our donors, because we don't have rich donors.
No, I was about to say our donors, they give sacrificially.
Yes.
So it's not like, oh, well, I'm not going to miss this $20 or however much people are donating.
Yeah.
They do.
They give very sacrificially. Yeah. And I tried to explain that to other organizations sometimes, and it's hard because so many of organizations are, they have these very, very, very wealthy donors, and they can call and they can ask for a huge amount of money, and they know it's not really going to impact them at the end of the day.
Right.
And I would say that for 99.9% of our donors, if not 100%, that is not accurate.
Right.
And I love that because it's like all of us are in it together, and we're all working together, and we're all giving what we have. And even though it's a small amount, because I believe all that we have is small in God's eyes, God just multiplies it in this crazy way.
Yeah. I mean, we're not called to donate what we're not going to miss. It wasn't like, oh, I have this really great lunch, and I'm not going to miss this one loaf.
Right. It's not,
he gave all of them.
Right. He did not give 1 loaf and 1 fish, or just 1 loaf, or half a loaf and half a fish. He gave all he had to eat to Jesus, who then turned around and turned it into something phenomenal. And that's what I see every day with our donors. They're giving sacrificially. They're giving up. They could have better furniture, a nicer car, a bigger house, a better vacation.
Probably a dozen eggs.
Yeah. And they give that up so that lives can be saved from abortion and hearts can be changed for Jesus. And it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen.
Yeah.
That's why I love fundraising.
And it does. I mean, we save lives every day. We have... I'm thinking about this week we had a local client choose eternal life.
Yeah.
And that happens on the chat line as well. We had multiple calls. So the Lord can use whatever you have. And you might think it's not a lot. And what could $10 really do? And we could tell you what $10 could do, what $40 could do. But ultimately, the Lord is going to use it and people are going to be blessed.
Yep.
And we'll be transparent about how your money is used, and
it makes a difference.
It makes a difference. So promiseoflifenetwork.org/donate.
Everything will
100% of your money will go towards saving lives.
Yep. And it'll have an eternal impact.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's a Jesus moment.
Thanks, everyone. I don't know what we're talking about next week.
Yeah, we'll see what comes up. I'm sure like something crazy will come up, I'm sure. If you have things that you're interested in hearing us talk about, like please reach out. You can email podcast@promiseoflifenetwork.org. If you're in our Facebook group, Pro Life Without Borders, you can comment and post stuff in there. If you have things that you're like, hey, I saw this in the news and I'm wanting your perspective on it, we're more than happy to do that.
Yeah,
so just
and
reach out.
Super excited when people send us links and are like, you should talk about this in a podcast.
Oh yeah. Actually, that should be, someone sent us a link. And that I need to look at it, but that might be the next podcast episode. I don't know. We'll find out. Right, so in the meantime, we'll find out together. It's about the things we found out along the way.
All right. Have a great day. We'll talk to you later. Bye.